Good day, and welcome to the Florida College of Emergency Physicians Medical Documentation Conference Call. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn the conference over to Matthew Strieger. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I am blown away. I love seeing all the names on the list of people that have joined us here. Some friendly faces from Florida and from around the country. So welcome to everybody. And thank you to the EMLRC for inviting me. We're going to be doing another one of these in a couple of weeks. So I'm excited to be here. Hopefully, if you like this one, you'll join us again in a few weeks for some other topics. So happy EMS week, everybody. Hope everyone is healthy and safe. We have a lot to cover today. I am going to take questions. I'm going to answer them at the end. So if you've got questions, you're going to do them in the chat through participant feedback, and I will try to answer those as we at the end of this. But I will tell you that if we don't get to the questions there, because we have a lot to cover in the time that we've got, I will definitely answer your questions by email. I'll provide my email address at the end, and you can all answer up and contact me offline for any of those things. This is normally an in-person 2-hour lecture that we've trimmed down some content out of for the webinar here today. So we're going to really pack it in here for timing. And I also note that a couple of the things that are a little bit more interactive and some builds didn't make it in here just because of the nature of the platform that we're using here. So I apologize to that for you guys. Finally, I'm just warning everybody that my cat Jones is joining us for the conference call today. You might hear him in the background meowing because he likes attention. So I apologize in advance for any cat participation that you might get today. So my name is Matthew Strieger. I'm a paramedic and an attorney here in New Jersey. Just a little bit about my background. I've been doing EMS for 34 years, I think, at this point. I started as a volunteer EMT in New Jersey in a little one-horse town squad, and I worked at most of the major urban centers as a paramedic and an EMT here in New Jersey. I was a medic in Greenville, South Carolina. Got my master's degree at Clemson and was a medic there for 3.5 years. I went from there to Cleveland, Ohio, and I was the deputy commissioner of EMS to the city of Cleveland for 3 years. Decided to do something different with my life, quit my job, sold my house, moved back in with my parents in my 30s, something you should never do, and then went to and graduated law school 3 years later. And I've practiced healthcare law for the better part of about 14 years now, and have spent the majority of that time representing paramedics and EMTs and other healthcare providers doing stuff. I have a law firm called Keaveney and Strieger. We have a consulting arm called EMS Aegis that we're working through today. My partner Margaret is also an EMS lawyer. One other interesting note is that I sit on the panel of commissioners for CAS, so any CAS accredited agencies. Thank you very much. We appreciate your support. We'd love to see CAS accredited agencies out there. The important thing for me is that I'm going to teach you medical legal documentation today from the perspective of a paramedic or an EMT who's still practicing, who has gone to court, and who has litigated cases like this. And I don't think you're going to find too many of them out there. I'll tell you that I'm going to give you different information than other people who may disagree with me, who teach this class differently. That's entirely up to them. But I'll stand by the things that I'll give you, that there's a reason that I'm telling you to do things the way they're doing, and I'm going to defend that as we go. But it might slaughter a sacred cow or two as we go, so don't be surprised if I tell you things that are really, really different from stuff you've done in the past before, and might fly in the face of what your expectations are for how to do documentation. I tend to focus a little bit on EMS charts just because that's the one that I'm most familiar with, but this is an agnostic to platform. You could use it with ESO or ImageTrend or any other charting program that's out there. And when I start this class off, I'm going to move slides here. Yeah, there we go. I tell everybody the objectives usually when I come and teach a class like this is to keep your organization out of trouble. From a compliance standpoint, the organizations want to not get sued, they want to have better reimbursement, they want to have cost avoidance, and that's all well and good. But the fact is that your documentation keeps you out of trouble. It keeps you out of professional licensing actions. It keeps you out of civil liability. It keeps you out of criminal liability. All of those things protect you. So if you're taking this class to protect your organization, that's great. But at the end of the day, really, really important that you do this to protect yourself, because when you go in, you can end up having personal liability for things that happened, especially from an administrative side, from a licensing, EMT, paramedic certification side. There's been a huge increase in those types of actions, and I think that that's someplace where you can absolutely protect yourself among all things. First, I ran one call yesterday in the 12 hours that I worked on the ship, but it was a very interesting, very complicated call, and I have no doubt writing that chart yesterday that court case is going to be in front of a grand jury and probably in front of a civil litigation, a civil court as well. So when I write these charts, I do it using my own lessons here today. So I have my disclaimers here, which are general principles of quality improvement and compliance, and you should consult with your medical director and your local legal counsel. I am not barred in Florida. I will tell you that up front. This is designed to be education and not establish an attorney-client relationship. It's very important, though, that this is not designed how to improve your reimbursement. This is the class that is designed to tell you how to get reimbursed for the work that you actually do. So we're not here to maximize reimbursement. That's called fraud, and fraud is a felony, so we're not going to do that. Also, I copyrighted these slides for obvious reasons. You're all going to be able to see what's going on and do this, but we really ask that you guys not go out and teach this class on your own for obvious reasons. So please, learn what you can here today, but please do not use these slides outside this class. We sell this class, we go around and teach it around the country, so we would really prefer it if you didn't teach it on your own. So I have this class set up in 4 modules. On the first module, we're going to talk about some threshold and cultural issues, and the modules 2, 3, and 4 are going to be the 3 reasons we document and focus on the triad of documentation. So normally this next slide is a build, and it asks the audience for the 3 reasons that we document, and it builds and things fly in and pretty and stuff like that, but we're not going to do that here because we're on a webinar. So let's talk about the 3 reasons we document on charts. We document for clinical, reimbursement, and legal reasons, and people will usually call legal CYA for obvious reasons. But being that we're recorded, we're not going to do that today. Clinical is the record of your care. So the first thing you need to remember is that the only record of what you do on your call today is what you write down. Some places have some video recording, and we may move in that direction more. I'm actually a huge fan of moving into a direction of video recording. But as it stands right now, the only record of care that you have is what you write down. So we're going to talk in a few minutes about if it wasn't written down, it wasn't done, but that's basically the standard for this. So if you did stuff and you want to get credit for what you did and you want to provide a record of what you did, the only record for continuity is what you did. And that continuity also includes the hospital. So the trauma that I brought into the hospital yesterday, they're going to look at my chart and use the information in my chart to guide a very critical trauma patient's care, probably for the next year. Because he's a really sick guy and he's going to have a lot of problems. And they're going to look back at my chart for continuity of care to see what happened, what the mechanism was, what was done pre-hospital, how he was injured, what went of it. Those things are all very, very important. And if we don't capture certain data points there, they don't get captured at all. So it's very important that you capture some of those maybe things that might be more obscure that you don't think is important to your documentation now, because they may become important down the line during the continuity of care. Clinical includes quality improvement efforts, though. So not only do I do this today for me to get better at it, for documentation for me, I do this so that we get better at it. And I do this so they get better at it for me as a provider, meaning Matt, the paramedic, gets better, for my organization, to make sure that my organization's patient care is up to snuff, and so that we as an industry, our state, and our country can see what data is collected. And that's why we use NEMSIS data. Now, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I am not a fan of the NEMSIS data set. I despise the way some data points are collected. I think they're useless. They're wasteful in time. I don't think they provide us with any meaningful information, but it is the system that we've got. And because a lot of that information is captured for a very valid reason, it's what we use. Because if you're not measuring it, you're not doing it. And that's an important adage of healthcare in the year 2020. And keep in mind that no matter who you provide EMS through, a fire department, a private ambulance, a hospital, we're providing healthcare on an ambulance, and you need to think of it in those terms. The second reason we do this is for reimbursement, and people are often loath to admit that we want to get paid for the job, although more and more we're starting to accept that that's really a big deal. A lot of people don't put a lot of stock in that, but the other lesson out of healthcare in 2020, and COVID is teaching us this in vivid relief, unfortunately, is no margin, no mission. At the end of the day, if you're not making money, you don't keep the lights on, and there's really only 2 ways we keep our lights on in EMS. It's fee-for-service and taxes. So if you're not getting tax-based and you're not documenting appropriately for your fee-for-service, you're leaving money on the table. And EMS organizations go out of business. They turn their lights off. The largest at the time sole source EMS provider in the state of New Jersey for many, many years shut their doors and ceased to exist recently because of reimbursement issues. So it is absolutely something that can happen to your organization. So the time you spend getting signatures and getting billing information and ensuring that you have documented medical necessity for your organization absolutely will make a difference to the longevity of your organization. Third reason we do this is for legal, the CYA piece of this, because at the end of the day, you want to do things that protect you and use language that protects you and doesn't expose you to your credibility being impeached. As I was writing my chart yesterday, I was thinking very, very clearly about what's going to happen when I say certain things about the mechanism of injury and the cause of the crash and the restraints that were used, because I know that there are going to be issues down the line. So I documented very clearly, knowing that those things were going to be something that somebody's going to make an issue of down the line. And I want to make sure that I can defend my observations. When you talk about the legal ramifications, it's not just getting sued for malpractice. We think usually in terms that the worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to get sued for malpractice, and that's not the worst thing. The worst thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to lose your license to practice, your paramedic, EMT, or nursing license, your medical license. Those are the worst things that can happen to you, or you can go to jail. And some things that we do in the legal world and in the medical world, have legal liability and have legal ramifications down the line. And you really want to make sure that the things you're doing are defensible. So that's the triad. And as you can see, that there's a three-legged stool. If you pull one leg out, it falls over. You can't stand on only two of the three legs. And it's also important for you to remember that the agencies that are responsible for those three enforcement arms share information actively against you. So you have to be aware that the things you do on this, if you get in reimbursement trouble, they're going to share the information about your reimbursement trouble with legal authorities and the clinical authorities. And that happens in all three of those directions on the triangle. So you have to be aware of that. So the next thing I talk about in my legal class for documentation is EMS culture. And I have my elephant in the room slide. I have to talk about the elephant in the room on documentation. And I normally do this in a much more interactive format, as you can imagine. And we talk over the cultural issues in EMS. But at the end of the day, EMS providers do bad documentation because we hate it. Because nobody likes writing charts. Nobody ever went to paramedic school and said, you know, I want to take care of sick people, but God, I just love writing charts. That's never happened. And I realize that, and I understand it completely. I know why that's the case. But the fact is that this is a very, very important part of what you do and what I do and what we do together. The time difference, and I always ask this class also when I'm doing it more interactively, the time difference between a good chart and a bad chart is between 5 and 10 minutes. You're going to spend the time anyway writing a chart. The difference to make your good chart a great chart is maybe 5 or 10 minutes on the average chart. Certainly there are some charts like the one I wrote yesterday that took me a lot longer than that, but on average, it's only a few extra minutes of time. This is a really important part of your job. You're judged based on this. The only reflection of your patient care at the end of the day is no one else is in the back of the ambulance with you. So the only way we judge what you did right now is to look at your chart. And I walk this through when I do this more interactively again here, because this is such a powerful piece of this lecture, and it's so important to understand the cultural issues here. I'm sure you've all worked with EMTs or paramedics or nurses or doctors that are really, really, really good providers, but they're just a jerk to work with. And that's probably not the term that you would normally use. You'd probably use something a little stronger than that, but they're just jerks. And if you've got somebody who's a phenomenal clinician and a really good healthcare provider, but they're just a jerk to deal with, at the end of the day, they're still just a jerk. You don't become less of a jerk. It's just as much part of your job. And at the same way, if you have an EMT or a paramedic or a nurse who is a phenomenal healthcare provider, they're really, really good at what they do, and they do bad documentation, that makes them a bad healthcare provider. And no one wants to be considered that. That is probably the worst insult that you can ever call somebody, is to say, you're a bad medic or a bad EMT. Those are fighting words in my world. I don't know about yours. But somebody looks at you and calls somebody says, you're a bad medic, they'll take a swing at you for that in my world. So it's really, really important that for your self-actualization, you understand that for the want of 5 or 10 minutes of time, people are going to think you're good at what you do or you're bad at what you do, and they're going to be right. So I start my next slide off with what's a patient, and I do this lecture all over the country, and I look around and I look at the definitions in the regulations of what every state where I do this has, because New Jersey has a very strong regulation as to what's a patient. I think it's exceptionally poorly written, but we have a law in New Jersey, a regulation on point. Don't feel bad, Florida, you don't have one. Florida folks don't have in the word, any of your regulations, don't have anything that defines the word patient. The patient exists a lot, but they don't tell you who's a patient. They have things about requiring an abbreviated patient care report immediately, that you have 48 hours to provide a full report from the time of dispatch. We're 24 in New Jersey. You have 5 years of records retention in Florida. We have longer than that in New Jersey, but it doesn't tell you What's a patient? And the reason that's important is you write charts on patient and you don't write charts on non-patients. And that's a binary choice. It's either patient or not patient. It's like being pregnant. You can't be a little bit pregnant and you can't be a little bit of a patient. So at the end of the day, once you make somebody a patient, you have to go through the entire process of documenting them appropriately. You have to have a mental status assessment. You have to have 2 sets of vital signs. You have to have a targeted physical exam. You have to inform consent if you're going to get a refusal or to provide treatment for the patient. And we fudge that a lot in EMS. And that's one of those places as a lawyer where I can make a lot of trouble for people if you don't do that properly. So for my money, being a patient is a binary choice. So how do I define somebody as being a patient? Matt's rules of who's a patient are number 1 is anybody who self-identifies as a patient. Somebody comes up to you and says, I'm hurt or I'm sick for any reason at all, they are a patient. And they may have some very obscure things. They may have some things that don't seem terribly acute. But if it's any kind of illness or any kind of injury, in my book, that makes them a patient and you're going to treat them like a patient. Number 2 is somebody else who's there, a third party, points at that person with specificity and says they're a patient. Now, that doesn't mean that the police officer at the scene says, I want you to go check everybody here. When you do, you're checking them to see if they're patients. That does not make them a patient automatically. But if a police officer or a bystander or a family member, somebody else points at somebody and says, hey, that guy right there, something's wrong with him with specificity, that makes them a patient. Now, they may not think they're a patient. They might not want to be a patient. They may tell you there's nothing wrong with them. But if somebody else tells you that something's broken with that person, you're going to treat them like a patient for your purposes and assume that something is wrong with them and document that appropriately. The third time is when they don't say they're a patient and somebody else doesn't say they're a patient, but you get there and you look at them and say, well, you know what? In my authority as an EMT, paramedic, or other healthcare provider, I'm going to make you a patient because I see something broken. I can see that you're altered. I can see that you're bleeding. I can see that you're injured in some way. And if I can see any of that stuff, I'm going to make you a patient on my authority. Now, if it doesn't have any of those 3 things, then you're not a patient. So to my money, and I think it saves us a lot of difficulty down the line, if you're not a patient, you're not a patient. And if you're not a patient, then you don't have to get a patient care report or a refusal. And we do these half-assed refusals all the time. Sorry about that. But we do them. And we do this halfway thing where we're like, well, I'm just going to get some demographic information and have you sign a refusal. Well, if they're refusing, they have to have the ability to refuse. They have to be hemodynamically stable. They have to have a mental status that can refuse. They have to have injuries that you're comfortable with them refusing. If you didn't do an assessment, then you didn't get any of that. So don't fall in that trap. We do that a lot. We're really, really bad at this in the EMS industry overall. For my money, if I do all of those things and I say, no, you don't have any of those, I'm going to document at some point that you did have an encounter with me, but it's not a patient encounter. It's a non-patient encounter. And I say, hey, I talked to a person. They said they weren't hurt. So I have some documentation that I talked to Matt, guy who was in car accident who said he wasn't hurt. So I can prove that I did talk to you, but I don't call that person a patient unless they actually present as a patient. And I document that on a separate form. The other thing we're really bad at in EMS is the concepts of consent and refusal. And I have an entire lecture on this, and I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. This slide normally alone will take me a good 20 minutes, and I have an hour-long lecture on this point to begin with. But I don't think you can talk about documentation without having this basic foundational piece. Don't talk to me about being competent. Competent is a legal term, okay? Competent is what a judge or a law establishes. So if the conservator, if the judge says that Brittany is too cray-cray to manage her own affairs, the judge says Brittany's not competent. That's a judge's decision. We don't deal in competence, so don't use that term. We deal with the 3 magic words of decision-making capacity. Decision-making capacity is this giant assessment of everything you do that says that when I put it all together, this person has decision-making capacity. I ask this question of my groups normally when I do this dynamically and say, can you be alert and oriented but still lack decision-making capacity? The answer is absolutely you can. There are tons of people that can answer those 3 questions right but have no grasp of what's going on with them for real and can articulate that back to you in a way that you understand that their brain is really processing what's going on today. A&O times 3 or times 4 is a terrible assessment of that. I don't think the opposite's true, though. I don't think that if you have decision-making capacity, that you're not A&O times 3. You have to be A&O times 3 to have decision-making capacity, okay? So it doesn't mean that you automatically have it, but you can't have decision-making capacity without being at least alert and oriented. But there's other stuff that goes into that. It's how the person answers questions. Do they send things back to you appropriately? What does their clinical exam show? Are they answering questions? Do they have some medical problems that are going on that may be affecting their mentation? Hypovolemia, distracting injuries, drug or alcohol abuse, hypoxia. There's a ton of things that go into the clinical exam. The environment of care also also is something you have to look at. Is there a person or something else in the environment that is influencing that person's decision-making capacity? If the answer is that they have decision-making capacity, that's great. Then you can do informed consent, but this is a two-part thing. You have to have decision-making capacity to be able to do any kind of informed consent. Decision-making capacity means, for me, that the computer that is your brain is processing stuff. If I put things into one side, I get stuff out the other. That means that the computer is working. For me to get informed consent, I then have to put the stuff in. So you have to do it a second time. You have to do this in two steps. The second thing I do is I say, hi, we're going to offer you treatment, transport, destination choice, anything like that. And the person says, yes, no, or I'm not sure about that. Tell me some more. We have the right as people to self-determination to say, I don't want that. And they have the right to pick or choose. They have the right to make bad healthcare decisions for themselves and say, well, I know it's the wrong thing to do for me, but I'm going to do it anyway. People live their lives making terrible healthcare decisions. I'm not going to, I do this class not in the time of COVID, but right now, people are going around the country making terrible healthcare decisions for themselves in the context of a pandemic and when to reopen their lives and social distancing and masking and medical treatment that may be offered to them. This is an interesting time for the right of the person to make bad healthcare decisions. And again, whether those healthcare decisions impact themselves versus they impact other people is kind of an ethics question that I'm not going to dive into right now. But we're going to do informed consent. Basically, you're saying, here's the risks, here's the benefits. Do you accept those for yourself? If they say yes, then they can accept or refuse any combination of assessment, treatment, transport, or destination. If they don't have decision-making capacity, if the brain's not working, then they can't do an informed consent on any of those things. So I hope that everybody understood what I just went through there in a couple of minutes, because it's a really, really complicated set of legal context, of the clinical context, and ethics as well, candidly, to walk through that. Let's talk about the three reasons we document at the end of the day. And the first one is clinical. So I said this before, and I'll say it again. It's the rule of this is if it's not documented, it wasn't done. So all of this charting by exception BS, and I'm sorry, charting by exception is BS, means nothing. If you're doing charting by exception, today is the day to stop doing that. It means nothing. You can't tell me that everything was normal unless I charted otherwise, because you have no way of telling me what you actually assessed or not. Okay? If I see pupils on the average patient, and I go, you assess pupils? I call shenanigans on that, because we don't assess pupils on all these patients where people are, the run report is defaulting to normal for that person. Unless you laid hands on it, unless you laid eyes on it, it wasn't done. Now, the corollary to that is that if it was documented, the presumption is that it was done. And it's a very powerful presumption. Healthcare providers as licensees are given a deference by the courts and deference by the legal system that you are honest, trustworthy people. That's why we give you the right to go out and stick needles and tubes in people and shock them and give them drugs and do all sorts of other cool stuff like that. We assume that you're going to be truthful and honest. So that's a pretty powerful presumption, because it's the only record you've got is what you write down. That being said, if I can prove that what you said wasn't truthful, you have big, big problems. Because once I can start to poke holes in your truthfulness, I can deflate your balloon and go, well, if that was wrong and that was wrong in the chart, how do I know what else isn't wrong? And I can draw into question from that lots and lots of other problems about your patient care and your documentation. So please keep in mind the presumption works to a point. Couple of quick notes on this is the document number one, what you see during your exam. If the nurse tells you the patient's bed confined and the patient walks to your ambulance, guess what? They're not really bed confined. So you have to document. Again, what you're told is one thing, but what you see is another. A great example was yesterday's multi-trauma that I did. The patient told me that he was wearing his seatbelt. But I'm going to tell you that from the physical assessment of the car, from the examination of the vehicle, there's no way that his mechanism of injury took place with him wearing his seatbelt, and the seatbelt was actually positioned in a place that I don't believe that he could have been wearing it. So from that, I documented that the patient stated he was wearing his seatbelt, but the injury pattern and the positioning in the car indicated that he was not actually wearing his seatbelt. I'm sure that's going to be an issue later on when this case goes to court. Similarly, I document the sources of my facts. My fact sources, I'm going to document. If the patient tells me all the facts is probably pretty obvious. But if it's not the patient who's telling me, I want to know that. A great example of a case that I reviewed at one point was the patient was struck by multiple vehicles and was in traumatic arrest. And my client's ambulance went and transported him to the hospital. And they indicated the patient was struck by multiple vehicles. And I asked the EMT who wrote the chart how he knew that. And he kind of gave me that look like your dog gives you when you're talking to your dog. Like, I know you're asking me a question I should answer, but I'm a dog. He gave me that look. And I said, well, who told you? And he said, well, I don't remember who told me. It must have been somebody at the scene. I said, what else don't you remember about this call? And he smiled and laughed because he realized I got him. Because if I can ask that question about what don't you remember, maybe there's lots of other stuff you don't remember. So when you have sources of facts where it's not intuitively obvious at the scene that the patient is the one relaying information to you, tell me it's per the bystander, per the family, per police, per fire, the medical record or the MRN indicates that. Whatever you've got, tell me what the source of that is. So this is really my favorite slide on the entire lecture, and I normally do this one much more interactively also. EMTs and paramedics diagnose every day of the week and twice on Sunday, and it is the original sin of EMS that people say we don't diagnose. Please, people, you diagnose every day on every call you go on. Please own it. Accept your diagnosis. The worst that's going to happen is you're going to be wrong. People are wrong all the time. The correlation of the ER physicians admitting diagnosis to what's actually wrong with the patient on discharge is less than 50%. You're not going to get in trouble. You're not going to get sued. You're not going to get disciplined if you tell people, this is my presumptive diagnosis, my working diagnosis, my clinical impression. You can call it all those things, but guys, at the end of the day, it's still just a diagnosis. Own it. Call it what it is. Call it a diagnosis and tell me what you think is wrong with the patient. When I read that chart, I want you to tell me this is what you saw and this is what you treated the patient for. If you're wrong, the worst that is going to happen to you from a clinical perspective is you're going to end up with an education moment. You're not doing something willfully wrong. You're not hurting the patient. You're not committing willful misconduct. There's no gross negligence there. People are wrong all the time. So please own your diagnosis. Tell me what that is. Tell me what you think is wrong with the patient. It goes a really long way. And again, when you find out, a great example, I'm using this because it happened literally within the last 24 hours. I just got feedback on my patient from yesterday to find out what I was right and what I was wrong about. Yesterday was a good day for me. I batted 1,000 on my guy's injuries. I was really happy to know that my assessment was complete. I had pegged everything the way I expected it to, and that made me feel really good as a provider. Some days I'm wrong, and I learn from that, and I go, wow, that thing I saw wasn't what I thought it was, and you learn from that. But you put down what your clinical impression is on every one of these. So please, and honestly, I'm really important that if you don't know, you can say these are the things you've ruled out, and you don't know what's wrong with the person. There's nothing wrong with that either. But if you're calling something, whatever it is, if we're giving aspirin or nitroglycerin or CPAP, any of the things that we do, even this basic life support interventions, you have to be diagnosing the patient to be able to do that, okay? There's no way you can do the most rudimentary of EMS interventions for a patient without coming up with a diagnosis and thinking you know what's wrong with the patient and treating that. So write down what you think it is. So the key to good documentation is one big word. At the end of the day, if you get one thing out of this class, I want you to just start telling me why, okay? If you say that this person was combative, people are going to say, why did you think they were combative? And you're going to say, well, they threw punches at me and they screamed and spit at me. Okay, well, those are facts that lead to the conclusion of the person being combative. You have to give me the facts that do this. If you walk into an ER and you walk in and say, hi, my patient has an MI, they're going to say, really, why do you think that? And you're going to say, well, this is a 50-year-old male with epigastric pain. He's radius to his arm and his jaw. He's pale, diaphoretic. He's burping. He's bradycardic. He's hypotensive. What did you just diagnose? Everybody on the phone call right now with this, everyone on this webinar is going, that's a guy having an inferior wall MI. And I didn't give you a 12 lead. I gave you clinical symptomology. And from clinical symptomology, I gave you the why. Now, if I walk in with that person, with that clinical symptomology, and I give that report with all those facts, the next thing that the person receiving a report from me is going to say is, wow, that's really cool. Let's go warm up the cath lab. I'm going to get a 12 lead and off we'll go, because that's somebody who's got a really compelling cardiac story, right? So with all of these things, the example, the most important thing you're going to do when you write your chart is tell me why. Why do you think this diagnosis existed? Why did you choose a particular piece of equipment, say, to lift and move the patient? Why did you pick a destination over another one? Maybe very obvious, it may not be evident. May not be obvious. Why did you choose to do something or not to do something? Why did you stay and play versus load and go? Why did you choose this medication over another medication? Those little details are the things at the end of the day that will be the good documentation versus the great documentation. This is your 5 minutes or 10 minutes of extra time, okay? Part of that is painting a picture. Part of that is a little extra details about the call, where the patient was found, how the patient was moved, which will help you for reimbursement also. Painting a picture of what the scene looked like before you got there. So I arrived yesterday, a great example again, on a two-car motor vehicle accident with a car head-on into a truck. fire and rescue and a supervisor and another BLS unit were there before I got there. We were the second new BLS to this call. Did I paint that picture when I got there? Absolutely. I drew as clear a picture on this call as I could so that when this call goes to grand jury or this call goes to a civil jury, they will be able to look at this and see what this looks like. Part of the reason is that it might be years before this case goes. If it's a grand jury, it might be a couple of months or a year, but it could be 3 or 4 years before I get deposed on that call. And I'm going to remember a lot of it, but I'm not going to remember a lot of those details. So it's really, really important that you come up with those details now so that sometime down the line, you can go, oh, yeah, I actually do remember that call. And the ones that are going to bite you, the one I wrote yesterday is very obvious because that one I'm pretty sure is going to go to court. But you never know. So that one might not, and other calls that I've run over the last 34 years may end up being the ones that go to court. So you have to write every case that you write that appropriately with that level of detail. Excuse me. 2 other quick points on this is, number one, if it's not obvious, please tell me what each provider did. My partner and I on the call yesterday worked together on that patient, but if that had been a multi-patient and we were the first to do ambulance, we would have split up. And I would have indicated in my chart that my partner split off from me early on because he is not really responsible for what happened on my patient while he was handling other patients. And we're both going to sign the chart probably. But I want you to understand early in this chart that we were not really responsible for this patient's patient care during that period of time. I also love the use of quotes. And I occasionally, as I teach this class live, will drop an F-bomb in here that the patient will say something where it's clinically appropriate to use some profanity or do other things like that to say the patient threatened you, for example. When you say the patient threatened you is one thing. When you say what the patient threatened you with in quotes, it's much more powerful. And I see the use of quotes as an extremely sharp tool to be used sparingly and appropriately. I don't just drop F-bombs into my charts indiscriminately, and neither should you, but there's a time and a place where the patient says something like that to you, and it's very powerful to explain why, for example, if the scene was unsafe and you retreated to a position of safety and waited for police, what made you? What did the patient say or do? If the patient said something threatening to you, using his or her exact words there can be very, very powerful. So that's my goal on painting a picture. Going to the clinical EPCR stuff, I said before, I'm not a huge fan of the NEMSIS data set, but you're going to use it when it's there. And the reason you're going to use it is because we want to be able to run charts and run reports later on off your chart. A great example of one of my clients was trying to see their 12-lead compliance in STEMI, and they had like a 12% STEMI 12-lead compliance. And we looked at it and said, no, that can't be right. You know why? We're documenting the 12-lead being done in the activity log as a free text, not checking the box that said 12-lead. You don't check the box that says 12-lead, you did it, but we can't run that report. So please, if there's a box to be used, use it. If there's not a box to be used, then you put it in free text. Chief complaint is what the patient says is wrong with you. My guy yesterday, his chief complaint was pain in his feet and bleeding from the head from a giant scalp laceration. Okay, what's his diagnosis? His diagnosis was, traumatic head injury, open fracture right ankle, right upper quadrant pain, and suspected neurologic, head bleed from his repetitive questioning and altered mental status. Very, very big difference between what the person says. Chest pain is a complaint. Chest pain can be cardiac chest pain. It could be non-cardiac chest pain. It could be COVID-19. It could be pulmonary embolism. It could be emphysema. There's a lot of things that chest pain can be. So when you're telling me chest pain is a chief complaint, tell me what kind of chest pain you think it is in your diagnosis. My scene box is what the scene looked like, how the patient was found, and what was done prior to arrival. So I put all that stuff in there to paint a picture of what it looked like when I got there. But the HPI is really where the bulk of my stuff goes. HPI is a mechanism, the relevant assessment to this patient, pertinent positives and pertinent negatives about what I saw with my assessment related directly to what I'm dealing with today. That's my HPI. Can some stuff go in HPI and stuff go in scene? Absolutely. There's not really much of a difference in that. The trick to me is HPI plus chief complaint equals diagnosis. That's kind of how you're going to explain this. When you do the poor man's diagnostic math or charting math, the charting math is chief complaint plus HPI equals diagnosis. Scene is kind of thrown in there too. Okay, but that's really the way you should think about this as you make your case. One other thing that's really important on the EPCRs, and I said this before in charting by exception, if you are running and you are the person who is the owner of your charting system's back end, you need to go in tomorrow and change everything you've got from normal or WML or WDL or assume normal should not be the defaults. They should all be defaulted to not assess until you manually change it to something that you assess. Please, please, please. I am litigating a case right now where things were just defaulting to normal and they weren't, and it ended up creating inconsistencies on my chart that I am in the process of explaining away in an active case for 2 EMTs professional certifications, because the charting system is what created that. Remember, WNL doesn't mean within normal limits. WNL means we never looked. Some quick clinical flags that are automatic clinical flags for me. We learned OPQRST in about day 5 of EMT school as part of your assessment. It actually matters. That's actually a really good mnemonic to make sure that you're hitting all the flags, okay? What the onset, what they were doing when the onset happens, what provokes the pain, what the pain quality is, does it radiate, what's the severity, and the time. We ask for a qualitative and quantitative pain assessment on all of our patients, okay? So I want to know what it feels like, that's the quality, and the severity, quantity. So if I want a qualitative and quantitative pain assessment and I do an OPQRST, I've got it. I really want 2 sets of vitals or a damn good reason why you didn't get me a second set of vitals. The first set of vitals doesn't really tell you much. It tells you what the patient is doing right now, but it doesn't tell you how they're trending. If the patient is getting sicker or better or anything in between, or they're not changing at all, 1 set of vitals doesn't tell you a whole lot. So you really need that second set of vitals. General weakness is a terrible thing to write, and that is almost always going to get you a clinical flag in my world. You got to tell me what was weak, what activity of daily living can they not do. That's really important. And finally, with this, I usually have a creative back and forth on, do we do a pupillary assessment on a person with an uncomplicated ankle fracture? Because for the most part, if I see pupils on an ankle fracture, I'm either thinking that your charting system is defaulting to normal when it wasn't, or you're lying, because most people don't assess pupils on a guy or a gal that just breaks their ankle, unless they do, and unless there's a good reason to do it. And you as a clinician have to look at the world and say, hey, you know what, this is an ankle fracture, but I don't think it is. I think the ankle fracture was really a syncopal episode, or the ankle fracture was a fall, or the ankle fracture was a seizure, or some other thing that happened prior to my arrival that created the ankle fracture. And that's actually your secondary issue, not your primary issue now. So you have to use the big bucks that you get paid and your big brains and your clinical experience to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to look for stuff. I'm going to see things that are not that. And that's when I'm going to use my my index of suspicion to raise this and say there's something more going on here. And if you've been doing this job for long enough, and again, if we were doing this live, I would tell you the story. I have a story of at least one great call in my life that happened when I was a medic in Mercer County, New Jersey, where the EMT, I was the non-transport ALS, and the EMT on the call threw me a little bit of a lifeline and said, hey, I just noticed that this person was incontinent. And that made me say, wow, this is maybe something more than what I'm looking at right now. There's something else going on here, and I really need to look a second time. And the person actually had a bleed and died several hours later of this. So they caught me on that one, and I was lucky, and I learned from that. And if you've been doing this for some length of time, then you've learned from that too, I hope. Last piece of clinical is you got to document your patient handoff. I want you to tell me that you did transfer care to whom, where it took place. Those are the 3 absolute things that have to happen. The last thing that I note in here is that if you did have an adverse action, this is a weird practice tip, but if you had an adverse action on the way to the hospital, you had a wrong med, you had a patient drop, you got an MDA, something untoward happened, you have to not just document that took place in your chart, but you have to document that you reported that to the ER staff. Weird practice tip. But if you don't do that, I've seen some cases where they tried to show that as some kind of nefarious conduct by the EMS providers, that they were trying to hide that or cover it up in some way, which is kind of weird, but that's what I've seen some cases that show that. The thing that's on your screen right now, just to show you, is called the IPASS handoff form. This is something that Hackensack Meridian Health, one of my clients up here, developed as a scratch pad and a leave behind, but more importantly, as a structured handoff tool to try to report the information that took place in the pre-hospital world to the ED in a structured way that gets their attention so you don't lose them. Because we have a huge problem of handoff of care from a liability perspective. So that's something that if anybody's interested in that, I can get you that offline. I just wanted to kind of show you what that looked like here. So let's talk about reimbursement, because reimbursement's a big deal, and this is an area that we think we have a good grasp on, but I don't think we always do. So Medicare is the primary place we look for Medicare for reimbursement guidance. Okay, Medicare wants 2 things. They want reasonableness and medical necessity. And we usually just talk about this in the context of medical necessity. The first thing is, does the patient need to go somewhere to begin with? If I can bring the care to the patient rather than the patient to the care, then it's not reasonable for them to move at all, and Medicare won't pay. If it's reasonable to move them, is it medically necessary that they go by ambulance and level of care. So you can't move somebody by SCTU capable transport medic unit if the person was capable of being transported by BLS and then bill for that. That would be fraud. So keep in mind, Medicare takes a very dim view of upcoding claims, taking cases that are BLS and making them ALS, doing medically unnecessary transport, making fake patients, or otherwise falsifying documentation. Those things are considered fraud. You don't stop, you don't pass go, and you don't collect $200, you go directly to jail. Fraud is a felony, okay? And Medicare is not an insurance company. Medicare is the federal government, and they write their own rules for this stuff. And they do not have a sense of humor. So there's 8 things here that get you medical necessity, and you can hear my cat coming down to join the conversation right now. Medical necessity for emergency calls qualifies as an acute injury or illness, restraint use, unconscious or shock, oxygen required, cardiac or respiratory disease, stroke, fractures, and hemorrhage. The thing is, with all of that, you have to tell me the magic word. You have to tell me why those things existed and why the person needs to go to the hospital because of those things by an ambulance, okay? That's the key. So you got to give me the whys on all of the emergency things. And Medicare is no longer just taking your word for stuff. There have been some recent cases where Medicare has come back and said, well, that's lovely that you said they required oxygen. Why did they require oxygen? And why did that require them to go to the hospital by ambulance? There's plenty of people that walk around and live on 2 liters or 4 liters of nasal oxygen 24/7. They don't automatically get an ambulance. You have to tell me why they had the condition, and you have to tell me why that means they needed an ambulance. Similarly, there's something called the emergency rule. Emergency does not mean responding lights and sirens. It means that you respond to a non-scheduled event, a you call it and you'll say to the person, we'll be back at 2 o'clock. Thanks for calling right now. That's a schedule. That's non-emergency. If it's an emergency call, that means that you get up and you go to it expeditiously. Not lights and sirens, but you go to it in the time when it comes in. You can stack calls if you're too busy and hold calls in the system and still call those calls emergency calls. But the fact is, you have to go to it basically when they come in. That's what makes it an emergency, okay? For units that are out doing ALS assessments, if you're dispatched to a call based on protocol and you're not self-dispatching and you do an ALS assessment but don't provide ALS, that still means you get paid at the ALS rate. So you've got to dump the document in here, the presumptive emergency condition and the dispatch information and the whys on all of that. Non-emergency is, I think, the one where you get the most scrutiny, of course, because this is the place where there's the most fraud. Medical necessity for non-emergency means that they can only be moved by stretcher or they're bed confined. Bed confined is 3 things, and it's an and, not an or here, okay? It's that they can't get up from bed without assistance, they can't walk, and they can't sit in a chair, including a wheelchair. But the trick again with this is, if you just check off those 3 boxes and say, this person had all 3 of those things, you don't tell me why those circumstances exist, you have the same problem. You haven't documented the conclusion without any of the supporting facts, and that does not hold water. If you bring that to Medicare, Medicare is not going to accept that just because you check the box, unless your documentation indicates why this person couldn't sit in a chair, why they can't walk, why they can't get up from bed without assistance, okay? That is absolutely critical that you include the why. If you just have check boxes for those 3 things and check them with no other supporting information, you have a problem, okay? On interfacility calls, just a quick note here, you must be upgrading the care. It's got to be services not available at the origin that's available at the destination. You have to include at least a perfunctory explanation of that in your EMS documentation. You can't just have it be that it's coming from the physician's order or that it's in the progress notes, because those documents are not going to be with you when Medicare comes back in 2, 3, or 6 years and audits you and says, hey, prove to me why this person needed to go from hospital A to hospital B. If the answer is, well, it was in that chart, well, that chart's not with you right now, and you're not going to get it. So you have to include some basic information going for trauma care, neuro care, obstetrical care, whatever the thing is that they don't have at the origin, that they have at the destination. You absolutely have to include that there, okay? If you're documenting, transporting for patient preference, patient wants to go there, but it's not medically necessary, document that so your billing people know how to handle that, because you cannot bill that person for that, okay? And finally, with this, again, if the origin of the destination types are not super obvious, please put that in your chart at some point. A lot of times you come from a street address, and the street address can be an acute care hospital with doctor's offices and subacute rehab and a dialysis center, and they all share the same street address. They have non-patient care areas. If it's not super obvious where you're coming from or where you're going to, please indicate that on the chart so that the billing people can come back later on and do that. Finally, on billing, one really important thing is Medicare signature requirements, and we're in the middle of dealing with the COVID modified requirements, which really aren't terribly modified. But at the end of the day, you can do the best care in the world. And if you don't get your Medicare signature requirements, you get nothing. Good day, just like Willy Wonka said, okay? You absolutely have to have your signatures in there appropriately. I don't want to go into that right now because the signature requirements for Medicare are a class in and of themselves, but please to reemphasize to everyone on this call and to your providers that the signature requirements for Medicare are absolutely critical to getting paid by Medicare. So let's talk about legal issues, which is really the last module for this, and I think we're really close to hitting our marks for time. I'm really glad we did here. I have Matt's rules of the EPCR, and this is the place where I'm a little bit more controversial than some other people here, okay? The two first things are don't document the same information twice, and make sure that the NEMSIS data matches your actual presentation for the patient. So the first thing is, if you've got a box where you filled in information someplace, your HPI box, don't retype that. Don't take it someplace else in the chart and figure, well, it's in HPI, but now I'm going to copy and paste it or otherwise manually retype that information into a narrative. Because Medicare doesn't require, and neither does anybody else require, a big, pretty flowing narrative on the chart. I think that's one of those places where we've done it this way for so long and that's the expectation. But there's nothing that requires that. The chart can stand together. And the reason I don't want you to document the information twice in the same chart is you will create inconsistencies. You are human beings, and we create human error when you do that. You're raising the opportunity for additional human error. And when you do that, eventually, you will mess something up. So try not to have those unforced errors. If you have a scene, an HPI, and the chief complaint, and all that stuff in boxes someplace, there's no reason for you to then retype all that stuff into a pretty flowing narrative like we used to do for the people that are the old timers on this call who did the old NCR 3-part form charts. Those are fun, and I love those, and I wrote a great narrative. But there's nothing that says that the information in your HPI needs to also live in a separate narrative. Your chart can stand together. I hope that it does. It darn well ought to. The hospitals have charts that stand together. You don't have everything all in one place. You don't recopy information from a hospital chart into every other place in the hospital chart. It would be unwieldy to do that. So for me, my number one rule of EPCR documentation is to avoid duplicating documentation within your own chart to avoid unforced errors. The second thing is that if you have a drop-down box or a checkbox that doesn't match what's really wrong with the patient, just explain it to me. Patients come in an infinite variety of flavors and colors and styles, and the boxes of NEMSIS don't always match what you've got. So if you have something there that doesn't match what the patient presents, you pick the best thing you can and then explain it in your narrative. If the thing that the patient have is normal for them, if you have a patient with a GCS of 7, the next thing you should be probably doing is intubating the patient. But if you have a patient who's a GCS of 7 and they've lived in that state for the last 5 years because they're in a long-term care facility, well, then you're not going to intubate that patient. At least I hope you're not. So I want you to tell me that information. If it doesn't intuitively obvious there's a box mismatch, I want you to tell me. And if it's a baseline for the patient, I need you to tell me that also. These are the places where the whys really, really matter. The third one is not as obvious. If you have edits or alterations in your data that you import from another source, and the two sources we normally import from are LifePak data, automatic PCR data for your blood pressure, vitals, O2 sat, and EKG, and CAD data from your times. And I'm not going to make fun of any dispatchers on the call here today, but we know that the dispatchers occasionally will miss a punch and give us a bad time, and sometimes it's their fault and sometimes it's ours, but the times that dispatch gives us aren't always completely accurate. So when you have times that you edit, go in and tell me the times are edited from dispatch for accuracy so that it doesn't look like you're trying to cover something up, because 3 years later, I'm going to call you and go, well, you said the dispatch times were XYZ, your times are ABC. How do I know your times are right and the dispatch times are wrong? Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you're falsifying something. And a little narrative indication in there that I did this because dispatcher's times were wrong will tell me that, and I can say, okay, I get it now. You did that. It's a really easy thing. The same way with the imports, when you import clinical information in from an external data source into your EPCR and you edit it, you either selectively import or you edit an import. You need to tell me why you edited it, because I am able to, in every charting system, look behind your chart to the actual data sources, including keystrokes, and I can see things that were edited, and I will pull the original, for example, LifePak PCO data, and I will look and see if there's a mismatch there. And if there's a mismatch there, I can draw into question, once again, your accuracy. Anytime I've got these things, anytime I have an inconsistent documentation under 1, a data mismatch under 2, or an edit on number 3, If I have problems there, I can look at you down the line and say, well, you said this here, but there's some other piece of data that contradicts that. Did you lie? Are you making it up? Did you make a mistake? Even if you just admit that you made a mistake, after a couple of mistakes, I'm going to look at you and go, well, that's really great. How do I know what else you made a mistake on in this call? We've caught 2 or 3 mistakes already. And at that point, the accuracy and the veracity of your run report is completely in question. The presumption that you had earlier that we talked about, that if it was documented, it was done, is an enormous presumption. But through your own charting, you can actually get rid of that. The last thing here is that I note that you're responsible for the care provided over your signature. When you're signing something, you're attesting for the truthfulness and accuracy of the information that you've got. You can't just throw information out there and say, well, I signed it because I'm required to, but I didn't read the chart. When you sign a chart without reading it, you're signing it with your license number, with your certification, with your mortgage, okay? You better trust your partner pretty darn well. If you trust your partner to write that chart and sign, you're willing to sign it without reading it, you better have a good partner who you trust in what they wrote. A couple of common issues here that come up on charts from a legal perspective. I see sourcing here fairly frequently. In fact, I had a conversation earlier today with a client about vital sign sourcing. It is totally fine to source information in your chart and document it in your chart from other places, provided that you document where it came from. We occupate as part of a healthcare team. If your vital signs are coming, you're a non-transport ALS unit, and you're with a BLS unit, and one of you takes the vital signs and the other one doesn't, you just document who did that. That's easy. We don't go into the hospitals and have the doctor's blood pressure or the nurse's blood pressure. We're part of the same team here in healthcare, a part of the same continuum. No patient calls are really big problems for me. When you get to a call and you look around and there's no person there, occasionally there is a person there and you miss them. And those patients have a nasty tendency to die, which is a nasty tendency to involve litigation. So when you find a call where you're called out and you look around and you don't find somebody, you have to write a narrative explaining to me what you did to look for that patient. You knocked on the door, you tried the door, it was locked, you hit the callback number, you knocked on the neighbor's door, you blew the sirens, you used your flashlight, you looked in the window, whatever you did. I need an explanation there because those calls have lots and lots of litigation associated with them. Lifting assist is another thing. Lift assist actually has another word for it. Lift assist is a patient. Lift assists are patients across the board. I actually have the literature here, and I haven't incorporated into this, but the last time I taught this class out in Kansas for a client out there, the medical director of Johnson County, Kansas MedAct gave me some literature that showed that a significant number of patients who can't get off the ground die within 30 days. People that can't get off the ground are sick people, okay? They have stuff wrong with them. They have comorbid factors and stuff that you can assess and treat. They're all patients. Simply the fact that somebody's on the ground and can't get up, you have to assess, did they get hurt when they went to the ground? Did they break their hip? Did they break their back? Did they break their ankle? Did they have altered mental status? Are they hypotensive? Are they orthostatic? Any of those things. And assessing all of those things to determine whether allowing that patient to just be picked up and put back in bed without further injuring them or leaving them at home, any of those combinations makes them a patient. So remember, again, as we talked about before, those are the places where those people, you're going to take them and say, this is the person who's calling me for help, and on my own authority on top of that, I'm going to call them a patient. Because the real reason not to call that lift assist a patient is just to get out of writing a chart. And that's just lazy, guys. There's no excuse for that. We talk about subconscious bias and anchoring bias. Subconscious bias is where you have something that guides you and you don't want to admit it or you don't admit it openly. And anchoring bias is when something that you look at right now, you say, okay, well, I'm calling this person some non-cardiac chest pain or non-significant trauma, and it turns out that they actually had something. And it's hard to come off anchoring bias once you put that anchor out. I'm going to tell you guys the worst word in the EMS English language. The word that you should never, ever, ever, ever use is drunk. Drunk is a dirty word. Drunks are patients. Drunks are sick people. Drunks have heart attacks and drunks have strokes and drunks have trauma and drunks have metabolic issues and they have behavioral issues. And just because they don't have a gunshot wound to the chest or they're not entrapped in a car doesn't make them less of a patient, okay? So don't use the word drunk because when I teach this class live, I raise my hand first and say, how many people in this room have ever brought a drunk into the hospital and missed something because you called them a drunk? And I've done that. Okay. And if you haven't done that, you're lucky. But look at yourself right now and say, have I ever done that? And I'll bet you have. Okay. Because it's something that's very, very common. Okay. There's lots of stories of people that were called drunks and had other things wrong with them. That's your subconscious and anchoring bias. Finally, with repetitive trips, especially if you're doing the Dialysis, repetitive trips are the most common ones, but you cannot just cut and copy and paste the narrative from one place to another without changing it. Your narrative has to be a particularized assessment of what you had for this patient this day. If you're just copying and pasting and copying and pasting and copying and pasting, Medicare considers that fraud automatically. That's prima facie fraud for Medicare, okay? Basically, the last slide here before we have a wrap slide. Know the difference between subjective things and objective things. You look at objects. Okay, subjects are things that people talk to you about. So know the difference in documenting between subjective things and objective things, things that can be measured. Spelling and grammar matter. If you're not sure how to spell something, you need to look it up. Yesterday, my patient had an open, pretty significant open lower extremity fracture that had their calcaneus bone exposed completely, like it was in an anatomy book. I've never seen anything like that in my career. It was really a denuded bone. I had to document that the person had a calcaneus. It was visible. I looked up how to spell that because that's part of my job. I used my phone and I Googled the word and I used it appropriately because a spell check was not going to catch that. You need to make sure that your spelling and your grammar matter because it jumps off the page at you now. Most of the systems have the squiggly lines. Use them. But guys, use the rest of what you've got to try to get your spelling and your grammar appropriate. Very quickly, adverse event information. If you get in a car accident on the way to the hospital, you have a patient drop, you have to document that the patient had an adverse event, they were assessed for further injuries, they were treated for any injuries that took place, and that you reported that to the hospital. But the details of what happened on that adverse event will go down on a special report or an incident report. They don't go on the clinical record, okay? The only stuff on the clinical record is to the extent necessary to document what happened clinically with the patient. Finally, with this, my last two admonitions to you here. Number one is in the year 2020, HIPAA's been around, the regulations for 17 years. We still have people getting in trouble for unauthorized access to charts. Please don't do it, guys. There's no reason to. If you don't need to be in a chart, don't get in trouble for a HIPAA violation by looking at a chart just for fun because you're interested. And finally, you have 24 or 48 hours in Florida. You have 48 hours to write your chart. I submit to you that that's 47 hours too long, that if it's your mom, your grandma, your dad, your kid, whoever's in the ER getting treated, you really, really, really want to make sure that that hospital has as much information to guide their treatment as possible. The quicker you finish your chart, the better off you are. The quicker you finish your chart, candidly, the better your recollection is, okay? You don't want to wait hours and hours and hours unless there's a darn good reason to before you write that chart because your recollection of the call is better sooner than it is longer in time. So my final thoughts on this, and then I'm going to wrap it up. As I said before, the key to good documentation is why. Please tell me why you thought something, why you did something, why you thought this person had a diagnosis, because we diagnose every day of the week on what we do, okay? Give this the effort that it deserves. At the end of the day, people they assess you based on your documentation, and they will decide whether are you a good witch or a bad witch. They're going to decide if you're a good witch or a bad witch based on your chart first and foremost. Okay, that's the most the clearest indicator we've got as to what kind of provider you are. Okay, at the end of the day, the best paramedic or EMT that is the best clinician and the best patient care provider and the best patient advocate who does bad documentation. At the end of the day, still just does bad documentation, and that makes them a bad medic or a bad EMT. And I don't want to be a bad medic or a bad EMT. I don't think any of you do either. So here's my final wrap slide here. I hit my time marks pretty wonderfully. This is my contact information. You can see it on the screen. You can take a picture of that QR code. It'll import it into your phone. That's my office number. That's my law firm website and my email address. I don't see any questions on the screen here, so I'm going to hand it back to the chairperson in a few seconds. Oh, I got one question I'm going to have time for. So any other questions that come up, if you guys were not going to have time because we want to hit the 1 hour mark on this, feel free to email me at the email address on your screen, and I will happily answer your emails offline. Why would an organization need to complete a PCR for a DOA or pronouncements? Okay, well, a person who is dead certainly is a patient, okay? They're a sick person. The dead people are by definition sick, and you're called there as part of assessing whether the person is a viable patient or a non-viable patient. And we have that actually. That is a very, very common source of litigation, is people who you get there and you elect not to perform CPR and resuscitative efforts on them, and it turns out that maybe you should have. That is an extremely common piece of litigation. So if you get there and elect not to do that, then you have to document why you did or didn't do that. I think the greater question would be, if you have an obvious DOA where it's very clear to the layperson that no resuscitation is needed, why are you sending an ambulance to that person to begin with? Because if you're sending an ambulance to the person to begin with, that makes them a patient. You got to document on that person why the patient was a patient, and what was wrong with them, and why you elected to do or to not do something. In this case, if it's a DOA, what you elected to not do, which is to resuscitate the patient. So that was the one question that we had time for that popped up on my screen here. I see 13:59 on my clock, so I think we're right where we need to be. I want to thank everybody for spending an hour of their day with me. Again, be safe. Happy EMS week. And hopefully I'll see all of you in 2 weeks again for another EMS legal lecture.
And this concludes today's call. Thank you for your participation. You may now disconnect.